2019, where she facilitates ACU's global academic portfolio. Prior even to taking this position, she served as Deputy Professor and Vice President for Academic Affairs and Foundation Professor of Law and Political Science at ASU from 2016 to 2019. She served as Dean and Arc Professor at UGA School of Public and International Affairs from 2013 to 16. Prior to teaching at the University of Texas, Professor Lindquist taught law and political science at Vanderbilt University. She also served as a visiting faculty member at the University of Southern California called School of Law in 2013. She is recognized as expert in the U.S. Supreme Court Constitutional Law and Administrative Law. She has co-authored 3 books and has authored dozens of published articles and book chapters. Without further more, so I will ask Professor Stevina to start her presentation.
Well, thank you so very much, Ahmed, and thank you for the invitation to be a speaker as part of this Chancellor's Lecture Series. I consider it quite a privilege and an honor to be selected, and I thank you for the opportunity. I also thank you for the opportunity for me to revisit some of the most interesting academic topics that I think about. I serve in 2 roles now, one as Foundation Professor of Law and Political Science, and I teach constitutional law to first-year law students at ASU. But I also manage our global portfolio at ASU. And as I mentioned previously, was recently in the UAE, visiting with some universities, and look forward to seeing all of you at UAEU, my next visit to the region. So it's a pleasure to meet you online and look forward to meeting you in person as soon as the pandemic allows. Well, I thought hard about what I would like to talk with you about today, and a topic of great interest to me at the moment has to do with comparing the world's constitutions, and in particular, evaluating trends in constitutional development and change. So at the moment, I believe we stand at a time of great global shifts in the political, social, economic, and national landscape within countries and across regions. We're all aware of this. These shifts are taking place in the context of politics and government, in education, in economic conditions, in climate change, in technology, in globalization, and in migration patterns. And we know that many of these transformations have been exacerbated by the pandemic. At the same time, we've witnessed a surge in interest among observers who are focused on the role of the United States in global affairs, seen by many, at least at the end of the 20th century, as the last of the great superpowers. Now, in light of what seems to many Americans as endless wars and challenging financial crises, some critics are quick to note that the United States has lost its footing on the world stage, in part due to internal decline and polarization, and in part due to its withdrawal from global commitments and alliances, and in part due to the rise of China. Many books have been written in the last 3 years about threats to democracy in the United States and elsewhere, with titles like Steve Levitsky's and Daniel Ziblatt's How Democracies Die, Francis Fukuyama's Political Order and Political Decay, Anne Applebaum's recent Twilight of Democracy, and Robert Gordon's The Rise and Decline of American Growth. Political economists and historians such as Jared Diamond, Darren Acemoglu, James Robinson, Robert Gordon, and Ray Dalio have offered sweeping analyses of the reasons why nations or empires rise and why they fall. Among the earliest of these analyses came from Sir John Glubb, who was a British military historian. And he wrote in his famous Fate of Empires and Search for Survival that the endurance of great powers throughout history, including the Persian, Greek, Ottoman and Romanov empires is often fairly predictable. According to Glubb, most superpowers survive about 250 years, beginning with periods characterized by great outbursts of national energy, courage, enterprise, hardiness, optimism, and commercial expansion, followed by the accumulation of wealth and its accompanying decadence, and then followed in turn by internal dissension and a defensive posture toward other nations and peoples, ultimately heralding the decline of the superpower as a global influence. I am here to talk to you about trends in the development of constitutions, and it would be unwise to simplistically link the rise or fall of a nation state, or indeed a superpower, to the endurance of its constitution. In many contexts, constitutional change, amendment, or replacement do not necessarily undermine citizens' basic commitment to their internalized norms and system of government embodied in their constitution's framework. Since its revolution from the monarchy in 1789, for example, France has promulgated 16 constitutions, and after some flirtations with empire under Napoleon, has emerged as a strong democracy. Many states in the United States, which are governed by their own constitutions as separate sovereigns within the United States Federation of States, have rewritten their constitutions numerous times through the process of constitutional convention. The state of Louisiana, some of you are familiar with that because of New Orleans, my favorite city in the US, by the way. The state of Louisiana has changed its constitution 11 times since first becoming a state in 1812. Yet with the exception of the major disruption to state constitutions in the southern United States as a consequence of their defeat in the American Civil War, states that have altered their constitutions over time have nevertheless remained viable and effective units of government within the United States. At the same time, it would be short-sighted to completely discount the impact of constitutional rules and norms on the fate of nations. As basic governing documents, at a minimum, they establish the basic structures, institutions, and procedures of government that empower those governmental institutions to govern the citizenry, and they impose constraints on the government's power in favor of fundamental rights. Constitutions thus have the potential to shape internal politics, interest groups, and political parties that determine the future of nations. Any casual observer of the recent US election can quickly discern the impact of constitutionally defined structures on the process of presidential selection. With the arcane electoral college enabling presidents in the US to win the presidency without the majority of the popular vote. The US Constitution's federal structure enables states, as opposed to the federal government, to manage national elections at the state level that produces discontinuity in the electoral process, and the recent presidential election that you've witnessed, no doubt, from the UAE has demonstrated that very, very amply. Nevertheless, for decades, and especially since World War II, the US Constitution has been celebrated as the longest surviving and among the most effective constitutions in the world. Written in 1787 and implemented in 1789, the US Constitution has survived intact with only 27 amendments throughout its history. It's a very short document. It includes only 7,400 words. Many of you have students write much longer essays than the US Constitution. In contrast, the US state constitutions include on average 26,000 words. And on average, the constitution of other democratic nations includes about 25,000 words. So the US Constitution is remarkably short. The brevity of the US Constitution can be linked to the preferences of founder and President James Madison. He was convinced that shorter constitutions would be longer enduring. This position stemmed in part from the history of constitutions ratified in 1776 by the American states following our revolution from Britain. Almost all of those state constitutions were brief, focusing specifically on the establishment of governing institutions, their powers, and limits on those powers. For Madison, excessively detailed constitutions ran the risk of ensnaring citizens in the bramble of excessive regulatory restraints, which would cause them insecurity about the law and about their legal rights. His position was that simplicity, transparency, brevity, and ultimately endurance were the touchstones of a successful constitution. He advocated for a framework that is a procedural framework-oriented constitution that would provide the foundation for a stable and lasting political system. In contrast, Thomas Jefferson presented an alternative vision, arguing that the dead had no right to govern the living. Jefferson advocated that constitutions should be replaced every 19 years to accommodate the shifting interests of the electorate over the course of new generations. In the absence of such constitutional renewal and reconsideration, later generations would be governed by the dead hand of previous generations that would have failed to anticipate changing circumstances at the individual, societal, national, and international levels. And coincidentally, the average age of national constitutions around the world today is 19 years. So Jefferson may have been very prescient about what he perceived to be the appropriate length of or endurance of a national constitution. And Jefferson's position was more actively deployed in the states in the United States, where constitutions last on average about 45 years before being reconsidered as part of constitutional conventions. The state constitutions in the United States also tend to be more substantive, more particularistic than the federal Constitution. For example, the Florida Constitution, this is very different from the US Constitution. The Florida Constitution enacted limitations on marine fishing in certain waters and for certain fish species. The Alabama Constitution creates an indemnification program for peanut farmers. The Vermont Constitution ensures that the victims of suicide do not lose their rights to bequeath their assets to their descendants. These are the kinds of substantive provisions that almost look like they could be included in a statutory legislative code as opposed to in a framework-oriented constitution that sets forth the powers of government. And they are rarely found of such nature in the US Constitution. In fact, the Alabama Constitution is so laden with specific provision that it actually exceeds 330,000 words. Compare that to the US Constitution at 7,400 words. In fact, the Alabama Constitution is 30 times longer than the US Constitution. So we think of the US Constitution as a framework for governing constitution, rather than one that incorporates particularistic provisions that are unique to interest groups, to industries, or constituents' rights or responsibilities. Now, there are reasons to believe that short, framework-oriented constitutions may be superior in some ways, and to believe that constitutional endurance matters. First, because they focus on the institutions and procedures of government rather than on the nuances of choices within unique policy domains. Short framework-oriented constitutions are elevated above politics to a more super legal status that ensures that government actors conform to their institutional roles and submit to the limitations established in the Constitution. These factors suggest that short, framework-oriented constitutions are likely to endure as a fundamental institutional anchor, regardless of the vicissitudes of policy debate, economic location and disruption, or exogenous shocks to the system. The US Constitution is typically cited as the premier example of such a super legal document, elevated above the fray of politics and guarded by a set of unelected and highly independent judges on the US Supreme Court who ensure its procedural protections and components are followed according to its text. Endurance also matters in the following sense. What I'll call an entrenched, enduring constitution gives rise to the development of collateral institutions that support the norms associated with constitutional government. In the United States, political parties were not contemplated by the framers of the Constitution, but they have grown up in response to our system of elections and have benefited the electorate by providing policy cues in the electoral process and policy frameworks for government. Without political parties, it'd be very difficult for individual citizens to navigate the many electoral choices they must make on a yearly or every other year basis. So enduring constitutions have another benefit, in that they provide rule of law values, or they support rule of law values such as predictability and stability. And that's what Madison envisioned. Finally, they support the development of informal norms that bolster the constitutional framework. In a constitutional system, there is no external power to enforce constitutional norms. So constitutional republics must rely on self-enforcing norms to support and sustain the constitutional regime. In fact, now one of the largest points of conflict in the United States has to do with the adherence to these unwritten constitutional norms that are not in the document, but that should be supported by years of history and precedent. At the same time, though, short, framework-oriented constitutions like the US Constitution leave space for discretionary action and for judicial intervention, and thus may provide insufficient constraints on government actors who may exceed their powers in the view of the electorate. And norms may not be sufficient to constrain extra-constitutional action. Again, this is what's at stake right now, according to some observers in the United States. During the first century of the US Republic, states were faced with the financial crisis of 1839, which is a very interesting financial crisis in US history. And that crisis revealed that state legislatures had indebted their state treasuries ruinously by accumulating debt to finance state infrastructure. They were financing bridges, railroads, and canals. The accumulated debt and indebtedness of the state legislatures caused the citizens to become alarmed and to lobby for changes in their constitutional systems, including lengthening their constitutions with more substantive content to constrain the legislatures they no longer trusted. And they also changed how their judges were selected. They made sure that their judges were elected rather than chosen by the governor or the legislature as a means to check the irresponsible activities of the legislatures through the power of judicial review of state action. In addition, short framework-oriented constitutions are typically difficult to amend. Supermajority and multi-staged requirements for constitutional amendment, as is typical in the US case and in most short framework-oriented constitutions, produces a rigid document that may be politically impossible to amend, even if its application produces results that are at odds with national norms. The US Constitution has been amended only 27 times in 233 years. And in combination with the judicial philosophy that judges follow in the US called originalism, which advocates that the text of the Constitution must be interpreted in light of the understanding of citizens living in the 18th century, the short framework-oriented Constitution may have insufficiently flexible joints to enable it to adapt to changing local, national, and global circumstances. As a result, nation states like the US, with its short, rigid constitution, must rely on constitutional judiciaries to interpret the vague constitutional phrases and to fill in gaps that accompany such short documents. And this empowers unelected and often vulnerable adjudicatory bodies to determine constitutional meaning. So, what is the best form of constitution? Since World War II, the world's nations have moved away from the rigid, difficult to amend, framework-oriented constitution in a global trend toward a more flexibly amended, more particularistic, and longer constitution. In contrast to the entrenched and spare constitutional format characterized by the US case, other nation states have steadily adopted what some scholars have called an unentrenched and specific constitutional format. The principles underlying these choices are similar to those found in the constitutional reforms in the American states in the 19th century. The data is clear. The entrenchment of the framework US type constitution has been in decline. The data is clear. Since World War II, constitutional endurance has declined, while at the same time constitutions have grown in length. In the words of scholars Mila Bierstig and Emily Zakin, who are two prominent scholars in this area, constitutions have become less entrenched and more specific. These new constitutions are less sparse. They provide for more flexible amendment procedures, and thus they allow the Constitution to adapt more quickly to changing national circumstances and to accommodate specific policy choices at the constitutional level. The movement in some states toward popular constitutional referendum and initiative processes, whereby the citizens themselves may vote on constitutional amendments directly, this is true in many Western American states, enable stronger democratic influences to shape constitutions from the grassroots. The shift away from entrenched constitutions, characterized by difficult amendment processes, typically engineered by elected officials, reflects two potential trends. First, it reflects a move toward democratization and perhaps reflects a decrease in citizens' trust that their elected officials will follow unwritten norms. We certainly in the US have seen a decrease in citizens' trust in their government. More detailed constitutions ensure that elected officials enjoy less discretion in exercising their governing powers. Trends away from the model of the US Constitution may also reflect a backlash against judicialization of politics globally. The 1980s and 1990s witnessed a growing trend toward empowerment of judges on constitutional courts to evaluate the constitutionality of the validity of popular legislation. In some cases, those courts exercise veto authority over legislative enactments prior to the legislation's implementation. This is the implementation of a super legislature in the form of judicial review. And this veto further removes the policymaking process from the citizens at the grassroots. Even in England, where parliamentary democracy governed pursuant to an unwritten constitution for centuries, the power of the House of Lords to quash parliamentary orders associated with Brexit have come under increasing criticism. In the US, the Supreme Court has similarly faced increasing criticism on grounds that it has become too politicized. I'm sure you've seen this in the news. The recent nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the court, along with the Senate's refusal to confirm President Barack Obama's appointment of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court, represent recent skirmishes over the power of the Supreme Court in American politics. Yet the Supreme Court's power in the US is inversely related to the power of the people to amend the Constitution. When a Constitution is rigidly entrenched with vague and sparse language and is subject to a difficult amendment process, courts must operate as a safety valve to enable judicial intervention to modernize the constitutional text. That judicial function of constitutional reform was widely recognized in the US in connection with decisions invalidating racial segregation in public schools, in the famous case of Brown versus Board of Education, or in expanding privacy rights for women in the case of Roe versus Wade. In neither case did the Constitution speak directly to the issue. Instead, the court stepped in to interpret broad constitutional principles and draw a conclusion invalidating segregation and in expanding women's rights. So in conclusion, I'm going to show you a graph that I think illustrates what I've been describing. But constitutions are not always effective, simply because they must be at some level self-enforcing. They are the supreme law, and there's no one above them to enforce them. But they have the potential to play a critical role in coordinating among interests in society. And some level of agreement about the Constitution is better than none. Written constitutions offer the opportunity for conflicting interests to focus on a particular written text as a point of decision and interpretation. Even unwritten constitutional rules may operate effectively, but they require citizens and elites to share widespread agreement, and even then they may not function well. A great example is in the US, prior to the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt at the time of World War II, an unwritten constitutional norm limited presidents to 2 4-year terms. But FDR chose to violate that norm and run for a 3rd term. And ultimately, that led to the 22nd Amendment, which limits presidents to 2 terms. And that instantiated that rule into the written Constitution. So at bottom, the interplay between written norms constraining government actors, in contrast to the unwritten norms that govern actors within the governmental process, and that include judges who must interpret those norms, rests at the core of the debate between a constitution's length, specificity, content, amendment procedures, and ultimately its endurance. So in conclusion, I wanted to share with you my screen that will show you these thoughts in graphic form. It's just a single slide, but I want to show you how I've thought about continuum across constitution. So let me share my screen. And share. Can you see my screen? Okay, good. So if I can get, there we go. So one way to think about constitutions is that you can write a constitution along a continuum. And first, you can think about a constitution as being short or long. The US, of course, is at the one end of the continuum. And as I mentioned, Alabama's state constitution at the other with 330,000 words. How much content should go into a constitution? The second is, should a constitution focus only on the procedural framework that governs the nation in terms of its governing institutions? Or should it include more particular, more legislative looking material that governs particular policy domains? Should a constitution be timeless or time bound? In the US, we've thought of our constitutions as, at least the US Constitution, as timeless. But if Sir John Glubb is right, we're running into the end of our time as empire, as a great nation state. We're almost 250 years old. At which point in time do we need to think about revising our constitution to accommodate the future? Should a constitution be difficult to amend or easy to amend? The world's constitutions are moving to a more flexible system of amendment to enable the citizens to have greater say over time in what their constitutions hold. The more rigid a constitution and the more the shorter it is, the more it empowers judiciaries. Is that something that we want to enable going forward, the judicialization of politics? And finally, what kind of constitution which kind of constitution might one conclude is more democratic? One thing to think about is that in the rigid constitution that is difficult to amend, it may be that protects minority rights more effectively. Whereas the more democratic and the more responsive a constitution becomes to the citizens, the more likely it becomes majoritarian in nature and may reduce protections for minorities. And there may be other ways to achieve those protections, but that is something that is obviously worthy of our consideration. So I'm going to stop here. I know I've said a lot, and hope to have a chance to take about 20 minutes of questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much, Professor Stevina, for your insightful presentation. Now we'll open the floor for the question and discussions. Please.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes, Jose.
Thank you for the presentation. I love the computational approach to the text analysis of the constitutions. And I was wondering if you could go deeper into this computational aspect, like the length, and maybe you have analyzed all the factors.
Yes, there's two different ways to measure the length, and you can measure the length in terms of simply the number of words, and that can be an interesting that can be an interesting dimension. But in addition, what other scholars have done is they have also measured not only the length, but the number of provisions in the Constitution that are more particularistic. By that I mean more focused on substantive policy issues, as opposed to other elements of the Constitution which are not particularistic, but are instead procedural. So focusing on how the legislature is elected, how the president is elected. And what one study has shown is that it's not necessarily the length that matters, but rather the percentage of the Constitution that is particularistic. And in a way that is perhaps inconsistent with one's expectations, in the US, the more particularistic a state constitution is, that is, the more provisions in the Constitution that are substantively policy oriented, the more enduring the Constitution is. So it's not necessarily the length, but it's length plus, because you don't get a lot of particularistic provisions unless it's fairly long, but it's really the percentage of provisions in there that are particularistic. And the more there are, the longer the Constitution has endured in the individual state. This is directly contrary to Madison's perception that short, framework-oriented constitutions would be more likely to endure. Now, the US Constitution has endured, but if you look at other categories of constitutions, it's not necessarily clear that that's true in all contexts.
Would the amount of particularism in a text be a reflection rather than a cause, a reflection of the a high participation between stakeholders, and therefore that is what ensures the length? Or what's your opinion on that?
I think that's right. I think that is the hypothesis, Jose, that the that more particularistic provisions indicate that there's more democratic involvement in the content of the Constitution, and that the Constitution itself has become a forum for kind of resolution of conflicts within society. And so as a result, those conflicts have not forced the Constitution to be revised, but rather have been constitutionalized. Now, and that's just yet another forum in which those conflicts can be resolved. And of course, once they're resolved at the constitutional level, they are more entrenched, because then they have to be changed through constitutional processes as opposed to through the regular legislative process. But it definitely is a recognition, I think, that the democratic process is operating in multiple forums, including in the legislature, as well as in the constitutional domain.
One last question. So food has expiry date, humans have expiry date, and laws do not have expiry date. And there's this guy called Elon Musk who said, oh, if we go to Mars, I'll make sure that the laws in Mars have expiry date. And what's your view?
Well, you know, it's interesting. Some laws in the US do have sunset provisions. We call them sunset provisions, where the law will come to an end unless reenacted. This is true for some administrative agencies in state governments, for example, that they will be sunsetted unless they are resurrected by the legislature. And that is to obtain the result you're reflecting on, that not all laws are timeless, right, and can stand for all time and all circumstances. In the United States, in the subnational state level, some of the states have requirements that a constitutional convention must be at least considered on a periodic basis to reconsider whether the Constitution needs to be rethought. I also want to draw your attention back to Jefferson's recommendation. And Jefferson recommended every 19 years. Of course, we live longer now than we did then. But it is curious to me that on average, constitutions across all nation states in the world now last for 19 years. So whether Jefferson had some incredible foresight as to what the natural life is of a constitution or not, there does seem to be patterns that emerge and that are emerging in modern times about the life of a constitution. And again, just because a constitution ends up being rewritten doesn't mean that the underlying nation state fails. And I think that's one important distinction we need to draw. Nations can revise their constitutions, and in fact, in so doing, may be sustaining their nation state better than if they simply continued under the pre-existing constitution, which created conflict. And I think in the case of the United States, there's great worry that some of the rigid provisions in the US Constitution are really creating some considerable strain on our system, the Electoral College being one of them, which is widely accepted to be unchangeable because of the difficulty of amending the US Constitution.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Tayyib?
Yeah, actually, I do have a question. If you look at some of the recent surveys that happened in the United States, they clearly show that a significant number of American people view the Constitution as really an outdated historical lyric or artifacts of some sort, and it's no longer, because it does not really reflect the concerns of modern society. As such, its prominence and importance is no longer what it used to be anymore. Do you think the Constitution is out of touch with reality and therefore obsolete? And a follow-up question, the interpretation of the Constitution in different contexts leads to different conclusion, which creates a number of problems for the US. For example, the right to bear arms has been, basically kind of interpreted by different people for different reasons, and could have, kind of caused all sorts of problems to our society.
Yes, great questions. I think that the question of whether or not the U.S. Constitution and all its broad phraseology is now out of date really turns on the question of whether the U.S. Supreme Court is out of date, because as I mentioned previously, the safety valve that we use in the U.S. to accommodate our Constitution to changing circumstances is the U.S. Supreme Court. And the court itself, early in our history, Supreme Court justices died younger. Fact of the matter, I mean, lifespans are much longer now. And so one of the solutions, you'll be interested, you may be aware, is to impose term limits on U.S. Supreme Court justices, because we end up with octogenarians on the court, and they're simply not necessarily in a position to be in touch, perhaps through their grandchildren or the children they may be, but not as well in touch with the changing norms, expectations, economic conditions, educational conditions, technological advancements that the younger generations are. And so it's interesting how we've shifted, rather than changing our Constitution, we've shifted to considering term limits for Supreme Court justices as a means of modernizing the Constitution itself. I think that's an interesting kind of derivative idea of how one would do it. That, of course, would itself require a constitutional amendment, and constitutional amendments are very tough to achieve in the US, requiring a 2/3 majority vote in the Congress and then 3/4 of the states to ratify. So it's very difficult to get a constitutional amendment through, and that would be a tough one as well. The reason is, of course, now at this point, the U.S. Supreme Court is dominated by Republican appointees, and it would be very difficult for the Republican Party to support term limits if it would affect the longevity of their justices sitting on the court. So, we've reached kind of an impasse, a rigid impasse, and that's why these rigid constitutions are not necessarily surviving. No, it's a great question.
Thank you, Professor Tayyib. Any other question? So I have a question, Professor Stevan. So when you mentioned that the Constitution of USA is 700 words, basically what the major component of this Constitution comparing with the state Constitution?
Right. So the U.S. Constitution is divided into articles, and the main articles are Articles 1, 2, and 3. Article 1 sets up the legislature, which the framers considered to be the most important body since it was closest to the people and elected most often. So it explains how senators and members of Congress are selected, their term lengths, their qualifications, how they enact legislation, et cetera. So very, very procedural in nature, selected in nature. Article 2 is the article that describes the presidency, and it is itself very brief. There's very little in there about the powers of the presidency. He is the commander-in-chief, among other things, but it's a very brief. He can appoint heads of state, or not heads of state, heads of agencies, and nominates justices to the Supreme Court. He can be impeached. Those are in those two provisions. And then the third is an even briefer section that describes the powers of the judiciary, sets forth for the federal judiciary that they serve for life on good behavior, that their salaries can't be diminished during the course of their time on the court. So, and then what kind of cases they can resolve. And the other four articles of the Constitution are a grab bag of a number of other things, how states can enter the Constitution. There's some provisions in there about when slavery was legal in the U.S., how slavery would be terminated in 1807 in terms of bringing slaves into the United States. Information in there about issues where there are conflicts between the states in terms of their laws, so resolving those conflicts. So all very procedural in nature. Now recall that in 1789, there were proposed 10, actually it was 12, but 10 were adopted, new amendments to the Constitution that do include substantive constraints on the government. So the government cannot make laws that limit free speech. That's where the Second Amendment right to bear arms that Taib mentioned is noted. So there are some kind of substantive limitations on rights, but otherwise it is a very brief document really setting forth the procedures of how government will look, how it will operate, who will nominate who, how long they will stay in office, what their qualifications are, how laws are made.
Okay, great. Any other question from colleagues? Yes.
I need to learn about the UAE constitution more. I apologize for I didn't have time to really delve into that so I could make a couple comments, and I do apologize, but that'll be, next time I see you, I'll have some more information on some thoughts on that.
Yes, Dr. Muhammad.
Can I have a very quick comment. I think since, thank you very much, Doctor. I was not able to attend the whole talk, but just speaking of the constitutions of the United States, we know that I'm a big fan of constitution being simple and easy. Yes, many problems could happen as a result of that, but that's okay. I think it's simplifying things is much better. But United States is like United Arab Emirates. They're similar. We are federal states.
Mm-hmm.
And you find this in all federal states where the constitution is really short, very simple, and it's not that big like in unified state. So this is a normal thing because in the United States, 700 words, it talks about the federal government or federal states, not the locals. Now there is 50 states have different constitutions. That is actually bigger because it has to deal with so many things within their jurisdictions. In terms of UAE constitutions, is following the same path because it is a federal state, and we have a very tiny, small constitution as well, just the same as the American constitutions. So, what is your take on this? I'm sorry, maybe you mentioned this.
No, I did not.
Sorry, I was not here.
It's an excellent point, and one that I don't think has been fully explored in the literature, because you're absolutely right. Where there are sub-national units that have their own constitutions, they can absorb, as we have in the US, they can absorb a lot of the detail, whereas the federal government's constitution should remain fairly simple, right? And I do think that is an observation very much worth considering, and maybe why the simple 7,400 word US Constitution has survived as long as it's had, even in the face of its simplicity. And in the UAE, do the subunits have their own constitutions? Are they sovereign themselves like the US?
Yes. Yeah. They are entitled to have their own constitution, but definitely it's not called constitution. It's called just jurisdiction laws and rules, okay, which is separate from the federal one. Yes.
Well, in the US, it's interesting. We say that we've split the atom of sovereignty, and we have dual sovereignty in the US, where there's the federal government. Anything the federal government can't do goes to the states under the 10th Amendment to the US Constitution, as you may know. And so the states do have considerable power and authority within their own states and their own constitutions. And I do think that is an explanatory factor. And I really am glad that you raised it, because I think it'd be worth comparing across federal systems, because there are federal and non-unitary systems that would be worthwhile considering whether those have an impact on the specificity of particular constitutions. Your point is very well taken.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question, please.
Yes, please.
So first, thank you a lot for your presentation. And my question is related to two specific articles in the US Constitution. And those are the articles that talk about the right to bear arms and the presidential election system. So I know the Constitution was drafted more than 200 years ago. So I wonder if you and the majority of American citizens still support those two articles nowadays. Or in other words, I wonder if the US Constitution that is drafted 2 centuries ago still express the will of American citizens.
That's a great, this is the dead hand that that Thomas Jefferson was so concerned about, without a doubt. Well, first on the right to bear arms, that remains, I think, a major point of dispute, even though the Supreme Court has opined that the Second Amendment did protect an individual's right to bear arms. The language of the amendment, it's the Second Amendment, is very confusing. It talks about a militia. And so it implies that the right to bear arms is only connected to a militia, to some kind of organized state militia. But the Supreme Court nevertheless has read it more expansively to allow individuals' right to bear arms. And if you read the opinions of the court in those cases, there is a majority opinion and the minority opinions written by, dissenting opinions written by the judges. And they're both long treatises on the history of what the expectations of the framers were back in 1787. So, and they're very lengthy, tremendous detail about what historians thought, what was written in dictionaries at the time, and everything else. So it's just odd, right, that the expectations, one might think it's odd, that the expectations of the framers of an amendment in 1787, 1789 would be governing our decision-making today. Now, of course, the American people could amend the Constitution to remove the Second Amendment, but that seems politically infeasible. There's sufficient numbers of Americans who really prefer that the Second Amendment be read broadly. On the presidential election, there's also no question that there is a vast majority of Americans, at least on the coasts, at least in very heavily populated states, that object strongly to the Electoral College. Remember, the Electoral College, we don't elect our presidents by national vote. We actually elect electors within each state equal to the number of members of our congressional delegation, so the number of members of the House and our senators. And so that actually disadvantages highly populated states. They get fewer electors relative to their population than states like Montana or Wyoming, who really have a better representation in the Electoral College. And that's why presidents can win the Electoral College, but not win the popular vote. Now, there's one benefit to the Electoral College, and that is that instead of having, you've seen the lawsuits that have emerged, et cetera, out of this current presidential election. But instead of having a national lawsuit where we have to recount every vote across all 300 million Americans, at least the Electoral College keeps those disputes on a state-by-state basis. So we're only recounting votes in individual states. That saves quite a lot of work and probably a lot of strain and stress on electoral officials across the country. But it still underrepresents certain individuals, and it produces presidents who were not elected by the popular vote. In fact, I think since 1988, only one Republican president has been elected by popular majority, and that was George W. Bush in 2004. Otherwise, Republican presidents have been elected by less than a majority of the popular vote. So yes, there's a lot of Americans don't like that. Changing it again, very difficult to do. Thank you so much, Alwyn. Great questions.
Thank you. Any other question before we conclude? So, Dr. Tayyib, you need to say something?
No, No, thank you.
No,
That was-
okay.
It just,
Thank
it
you.
just brought back memory of the hanging chads and what happened between Al Gore and George Bush.
Right.
And there was in a way, that's what happens when you have a simple constitution like that. And sometimes it is innocuous in the sense that it does not really determine a clear path and how you move forward with the issue at hand.
Oh, and the oddity too, of course, is that we don't have a national election commission.
Yeah.
All votes are counted at the state level, and they do it differently depending upon the state.
Yeah.
That's an
Thank you
oddity.
for a great presentation.
Oh, thank you for the privilege, and thank you for causing me to have the opportunity to think about these fascinating questions. And I really do appreciate it. I miss because of my administrative role, I sometimes miss my academic side, and you brought it back to me, and I'm grateful for it. So thank you. I look forward to meeting you all in person.
Okay. So thank you very much, Professor Stevani, for your great presentation. And we wish you all the best. And we look for another great opportunity in near future for the collaboration.
Thank you very much, Professor Murad.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.
It's been my
Thank
privilege.
you. Thank
Thanks,
you. Bye.
everybody.
Bye.